Welcome back to God's Story, Our Mission. Last week we saw God's grand purpose for all of his creation. We looked at Genesis 1 and 2. We looked at Revelation 21 and 22 to see that God has a grand mission for all which he created, to be a temple, to dwell with us, to dwell with all that he has created, and that we as human beings, as his image bearers, have a special mission with God in that. To care for his creation, to be the ones that reflect his character, to be royal priests. Well, it didn't take long as we continue with that story. It doesn't take long for human beings to disobey God, for Adam and Eve to disobey God and to take God's mission, we might say, on a pretty big detour. Where there was blessing, where God had intended for human beings to have the fullness of life with him, to fill the earth and to multiply for his purposes, we see that that blessing is now overshadowed with curse, as human beings don't reflect God's image as they ought, limping along with the image and likeness of God deep and muddled up in their lives, but instead they prefer to reflect their own image, not caring for God's creation, but overrunning it with violence and sin and prideful ambition. But today, our purpose in gathering together is to see how God gives another grand, great commission, we might say, getting his creation and his world back on track with a trajectory not of curse, but of blessing, where God will undo the curses that we see in Genesis 3 through 11, where God promises to bring blessing back to the world for ultimate salvation so that God could dwell with us as he intended from the beginning. We see this happen with the family of Abraham. In Genesis chapter 12, we see that God gets his mission back on track with the promise of bringing blessing back to the world. We see this as God, almost seemingly out of nowhere, calls an old married couple, Abram and Sarai, old and barren, with no hope in and of themselves, but God comes and gives them hope with a blessing, not just for them, but for the whole world. In Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3, we hear Moses writes, "And Yahweh said to Abram, go from your country and from your kindred and your father's house to a land I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you. In him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." It's amazing that after so many chapters where it seems that God's curse gets the center stage as human sinfulness seems to get worse and worse, generation after generation, that now God's blessing returns as God calls and chooses Abram, who we know later on becomes Abraham as God renames him. With God's promise to Abraham, God's story and mission is launched on a trajectory of blessing. When we look back at how God's blessing is introduced back in Genesis chapter 1, we can observe that blessing is about receiving the fullness of a life with God, just as God intends it. And in that sense, it is creational and it involves material blessings. Abraham will become a great nation. He'll have lots of descendants. There will be generation and generation of his family. That is a blessing. He'll also receive a great name and reputation. Other people will be able to honor Abraham as one who has been blessed and chosen by God. Ironically, this is what the people of the Tower of Babel were trying to do. They wanted to make their own name great by their own actions, but they couldn't, because it's only God that can truly bring honor and blessing to people. But more than that, we see that God promises land to Abram. He will bring him to the land of Canaan, a land of choosing, a land of inheritance. And so we see that blessing does involve all the creational blessings of God. We don't want to pit creation against salvation. It's all part of God's plan. He wants to dwell with us in the fullness of his creation, to be with his people. But there is more. God's blessing isn't just about those material things. It is about salvation. It's through Abraham and his family that God will overturn the curse of sin. He will overturn death by the seed of Abraham, and he will bring salvation and fullness of life with God. That means eternal life, and we know that means getting us to the new heavens and new earth. Everything that had been broken in his creation due to human sinfulness and disobedience will be restored with this trajectory of blessing, with the future that God has for the world through Abraham and his family. As God chooses Abraham as the object of blessing, we also see that God intends Abraham's family to mediate blessing for the whole world. That's why God literally says in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, be a blessing. Abraham is blessed in order to be a blessing for others. It's significant that all of those nations in the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11, all of those nations that have been scattered and confused, that seem to be the object of God's curse at the Tower of Babel, will actually now, through Abraham, be an object of blessing, because God never abandons his mission for the whole world. God's election of Abraham is for the sake of others. Curse never gets the last word in God's plan and purpose. And we see this through Abraham, in his promise to Abraham. It is blessing that will have the last word. God chooses Abraham for others. In fact, all others. It's not about what Abraham can get from God, as if he were an island just to receive blessing all to himself, or maybe even just for his family, but it means worldwide blessing even to those other nations that aren't directly Abraham's descendants. That's part of God's promise to Abraham in chapter 12. Abraham's family will be the means for worldwide blessing that will spill over to all other peoples. Following Abraham and his descendants in the rest of the book of Genesis, we see how this begins to be fulfilled. How God begins to actually accomplish this part of the promise. Because Abraham blesses people that he encounters. Lot, his nephew, who will be the ancestor of Moab, is blessed along with Abraham. Jacob, Abraham's grandson, blesses Laban as he works for Laban, as he helps Laban to accumulate wealth and possessions. We see how God's promise to Abraham begins to be fulfilled. In an even greater way, we see how Joseph, Abraham's great-grandson, blesses people that he comes in contact with. He blesses Potiphar in Egypt. He blesses Pharaoh. He blesses the entire country of Egypt itself. As he trusts in God and is a recipient of God's blessing, we see how God begins to fulfill that promise to bless other people already in the book of Genesis. But this promise of God isn't magical, we might say. God is going to accomplish everything he sets out to do. It is God who brings about this blessing. Only God can bless. Only God can make Abraham great, and only God can be the one who ultimately blesses others. But he's going to do it through including Abraham. Implicit in Genesis 12, 1 through 3 is that Abraham would trust God and obey his commission to go from his father's house to the land that God would show him in order to be that blessing. Abraham has to trust God. He has to obey God. It's not that God's blessing comes as a paycheck for what Abraham is to do, but God includes human beings in such a way that allows human beings to be part of God's mission for the world. In New Testament terms, we could say that Abraham was called to be a disciple of God. He was called to follow God. He was called to be in the world, but not of it. He was to cut ties with family, with land, with the reputation that comes from his clan. All of these things that would provide an ultimate source of identity for Abraham now is replaced by his relationship to God, as God is the one who leads him and provides for him. God is the means of identity and blessing, not these other things. And so he has to break ties with clan and homeland. And in this, God prepares this in Abraham's family, that God isn't just the God of one family or one clan or one nation. That's how all the other peoples, after the fall into sin, after idolatry comes onto the scene, people would tie their gods down to particular bloodlines and places. But as God has Abraham break those ultimate ties, we see that God prepares the way, that God is restored to be the God of all creation. He's not a God based on geography or ethnic ties, but blessing will come in a universal way, even as it comes through this one particular man and his wife and their family. And so we see that implicit already in Genesis 12 is faith and obedience. These are important parts of God's story with Abraham and his mission for the world. And as we follow along with Abram in Genesis 12 through 25, Abraham's full story in the book of Genesis, we see that Abram's faith and faithfulness is central to how God fulfills his promise to bring blessing back to the world. Genesis 15 highlights faith in Abraham's life. Genesis 15 is when God cuts a covenant with Abraham for the first time, an unconditional covenant that will be through Abraham's biological children, and that they will inherit a land that God will fulfill this promise. God promises unconditionally that from Abraham's own family, biologically, his descendants will number and outnumber the stars of the sky. And Abraham believes. He trusts in God. His faith takes center stage, and God accounts it to him as righteousness. That is the right way of relating to God. It's through faith. And of course, we know from Paul's letters to the Romans and Galatians that this is how we are saved. We are put in a right relationship with God through faith alone, by trusting in his word, because this faith is a righteous relationship. And it's all drawn out from us. We might even say, and should say, it's created anew in our lives through God's Spirit by the word of promise. This faith is central to the whole story of Abram, because unless Abram actually is related to God rightly by trusting in him, Abram would never have obeyed God. He would never have become a channel for blessing unless he had first received it by faith. But from chapter 17 onward, we see that as God renames Abram Abraham from exalted father to the father of many nations, that it's Abraham's faithfulness that takes center stage on how God will accomplish his blessing for others through Abraham. It's there in chapter 17 that God gives another covenant, the covenant of circumcision, and it will be an everlasting covenant. But God also says that he expects Abraham to walk with him, walk before Yahweh, and to be blameless. Now, the Hebrew actually says, be whole in respect to God. Don't be duplicitous, but through faith we are to be wholly committed to God. And in such a way, God will use Abraham and his family and his descendants to bring his purposes to the world. Of course, this type of faithfulness, being whole with respect to God, can only occur because Abraham is already in a trusting relationship with God. He's already in that right relationship with God. He relates to him wholly through faith. And so he is called to walk in accordance with his faith, not to be duplicitous, not to doubt, but to believe and to express this faith in wholehearted commitment to God. We see why this is so important because in chapter 18, we get an episode where God tells us why Abraham's commitment is so important and how it plays into how he will bless the nations through Abraham. See, Genesis 18 is about how God comes back to Abraham to let Abraham and Sarah know that it won't be through Abraham's second wife, Hagar, and her son Ishmael, that the promise of blessing will be for all nations. Abraham will bless Ishmael because he is with Abraham's family, just as God promised to do in Genesis 12. But it will be through another means, a much more unlikely means, not through the young woman Hagar, but through Abraham's first wife, Sarah, who has been barren. Of course, this elicits laughter from both Abraham and Sarah. And it's from this laughter that we are told that this is what their son together will be called, Isaac, laughter. But it's really meant to be joy. Joy as God will fulfill his promise to Abraham and Sarah so that blessing would be poured over. This is the seed that will start the family of Abraham afresh as God sends us all on a trajectory of blessing. But it's there as God is with Abraham and Sarah to explain more how he sets out to do what he promises through Abraham and Sarah, that he also reflects on the troubling situation of the nearby wicked city of Sodom. Sodom and Gomorrah, whose injustices and affliction of the oppressed in their midst comes out and cries out to God. An outcry rises from the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. And God uses this opportunity to teach Abraham why his obedience matters. And he teaches us why Abraham's obedience matters as a channel for blessing. Genesis 18, 17 through 19 says, Yahweh said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, namely in the city of Sodom and Gomorrah? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I have chosen him that he might command his children and keep his household after him, to keep the way of Yahweh by doing righteousness and justice, so that Yahweh may bring to Abraham what he has promised him. This is so significant to God's mission through Abraham's family, because God says that the way Abraham mediates blessing to the rest of the world is as he himself learns from God righteousness and justice and teaches it to his family. We see that it's not just about Abraham's own discipleship, but how he teaches others in his family to follow after God, to learn from God, God's true character in the world. Just as Adam and Eve were meant to reflect God's character into the world, so we see with the return of blessing and God's promise to blessing, human beings begin to be set back on that course, to follow God. And it's through this restored relationship of God through faith that others might be blessed as well. We see here that blessing isn't some magical mechanism, but rather it comes through a restored relationship to God, through faith. And by that faith, we can once again begin to reflect God's character in the world towards others by teaching others who Yahweh is, by following after him, by learning justice and righteousness. This is so important for God's mission through Abraham. For Abraham, learning God's justice and righteousness happened right away in his own life as he was called to follow him. But also in this particular episode, as God invited Abraham to watch how God was going to handle the injustices and wickedness of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. In Genesis 18, we have a conversation between Abraham and God about whether or not God would actually destroy the city if there were righteous people in it. And by that conversation, Abraham learns a valuable lesson about God's commitment to true righteousness and true justice. Because God is the creator. He is the one that sets things right in the world with true justice. Abraham was to learn that so that he could pass that knowledge on to his future child Isaac, and through his family to the nations surrounding. That's how God's blessing would be mediated. And so we see that both faith and obedience have an important part to play in how God makes Abraham his launching pad to bless all nations and to fulfill his mission for the world. Faith receives the promise in a right relationship with God, but obedience lives it out and shares that promise with others in order to be a blessing for others. As we turn to the New Testament, we see that God's dealings with Abraham is central to God's gospel story and mission for the world. Matthew's gospel is framed by God's promise to Abraham to bless all nations. The gospel itself opens up with the verse, "This is the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham." And instead of tracing his genealogy back to Adam like Luke does in his gospel, Matthew begins Jesus' lineage with Abraham. Well, why? Certainly, Matthew wants to show how Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament scriptures and is Israel's Messiah, Israel whose family begins with Abraham. But in addition to these claims, we see that Matthew wants us to see Jesus specifically as the seed of Abraham who brings universal blessing. In Matthew 28, the resurrected Jesus says, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe, to obey, all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age." Notice how Jesus' commission echoes God's call and commission of Abraham. First, Jesus tells his disciples to go, to be in the world but not of it, as they go about, as Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, will show them where to go, just like God did with Abraham in Genesis 12. But he also says that the nations are the object of God's mission, in the mission of the disciples, just as the nations will receive ultimate blessing through Abraham's family. But we also see that Jesus wants his disciples to fulfill this mission by teaching the obedience of faith, teaching others to trust in Jesus, to be in a right relationship with Jesus through faith and baptism, but also one of observing and obeying everything that Jesus teaches, everything that Jesus has showed as Emmanuel, as God with us. We are to follow him, just as Abraham was to learn the way of Yahweh in true justice and righteousness, so we follow the one that shows us the fulfillment of the law and the prophets, who shows us the righteousness that surpasses all other righteousness, who brings justice to the world by what he did on the cross and in his resurrection. Jesus' commission is the one, just like Yahweh in the Old Testament, who calls Abraham and mediates his gracious gift of blessing as the disciples trust in him as Emmanuel, God with us. Of course, we could also go to Paul's letter to the Galatians and the Romans, where we see that Abraham and his family of faith characterizes our Christian faith, that we relate to God just as Abraham. Paul even says his whole apostolic ministry is the one that is for the sake of the nations, because he has been called by Jesus Christ for the sake of the nations to bring about the obedience of faith. We see that in Romans chapter 1. And there we see a commissioning of his own apostolic ministry that has all of the characteristic signs of God's promise to Abraham. It will happen in Abraham's seed, who is Jesus Christ, the true son of Abraham, as he comes through the family of Abraham. But through that seed, Paul's mission explodes onto the world for the sake of the nations. The nations are now the recipients of God's blessings, and it comes about through the obedience of faith. That is what Paul is trying to produce as he goes around preaching the gospel. Right relationship with God through Jesus, but in a life that is characterized by commitment, wholehearted commitment and obedience. We might say that Paul is trying to produce by the gospel families of Abraham, characterized by Abraham's own faith and obedience. That's what the gospel does for us. And we see how we continue that mission of God that he started all the way back in Genesis 12. We are part of God's trajectory of blessing for others as we receive that gospel promise in Jesus, but also how we live it out and share it to be a blessing and to point others to the ultimate blessing in Jesus, through whom we have a restored relationship with God, where we will enjoy the new heavens and new earth because of Jesus' death and resurrection. Next time, as we continue the story of God's story and our mission, we are going to look to the book of Exodus, where we see God working to redeem his people, Israel, from slavery in Egypt. And we see how God's mission continues by revealing who God is as the one who redeems us from bondage, who redeems his people, Israel, but also how in his ultimate redemption in Jesus, we are redeemed from sin. We'll see you next time. God bless.